We're currently heading towards a world where every group or almost every individual will have their own model that's fine-tuned to their preferences. So this will lead to a bunch of consequences that I don't think is desirable, such that you have models that pursue your political agenda by all kinds of dubious means, and it exasperates all kinds of political conflicts that we already have, rather than trying to find some sort of broad agreement and work for peace.
Hello and welcome to Polyweb. I'm your host, Sara Landi Tortoli, and my guest today is Oliver Klingefjord, co-founder and technical lead at the Meaning Alignment Institute. This research organization has been awarded the OpenAI grant to fund the research aimed at establishing a democratic process for determining the rules AI systems should adhere to. In this very fascinating conversation, we talk about how to train AI to make ethical decision-making, why value alignment is so important for democratic fine-tunings of large language models, and how we will develop as a society that learns to coexist and to rely upon AI for many things, among which governance and decision-making. So I really hope that you will enjoy this episode as much as I did. Oliver, welcome to Polyweb.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Actually, I'm very excited because this is the first time that I ever record in person. And I think this is also a very special episode. It's a conversation that I really wanted to have, because I think that what you guys are working on at the Meaning Alignment Institute is so important and it deserves the spotlight and really having a bigger conversation around this topic. Maybe to start, I think many listeners will be curious to know, how did you end up winning the OpenAI grant? For context, OpenAI posted a call for startups, I believe, to pitch them ideas and projects to build upon their LLM or improve it. And you were among the 10 winners of this grant. Mm-hmm. So maybe you can share some background context of how it came about.
Sure, yeah. So the grant was called Democratic Inputs to AI. And OpenAI basically wanted to try out some ideas on how they could create some sort of democratic process for what AI should be aligned towards. So how should these AI systems behave? And Sam Altman has said many times that he wants them to be democratic in some way. They shouldn't decide how this system behaves. So they want to try out a bunch of different stuff. So they did this grant program where they, as you mentioned, 10 different participants had their own little idea on how to do this. We were one of them. The program was launched in May, I think, and it's started in August. So they launched the initial proposal in May. We were in contact with them already back then, with some people from OpenAI, and we had already discussed an idea of how we would want to do this, how we'd want to go about creating a democratic input process. And then we submitted a proposal and won the grant in June, and then got working this autumn, or last autumn.
Wow, this is very exciting. So you're currently actually developing it with them and receiving supports and feedback?
No, so we actually finished with the work we did together with them. It began in August and we finished sometime in November. And to summarize it briefly, what we did was that we created a process where people talk with a chatbot about how they think ChatGPT should behave. And this chatbot was trained to drill down into what their underlying values are. So we don't just collect their initial responses, but we try to really drill down into why do you think like that? And then we use these to create an alignment target, something that you can use to align towards and train an ML model towards. And this work was done in autumn, and now we're actually in the process of ourselves fine-tuning a model based on this kind of data.
Okay. Very interesting. By the way, I tried the GPT. I'll put the link in the description if more folks want to try it. It's on the GPT store. And it was very fascinating to see how it starts very broad and then progressively it asks you question upon question to really drill down to like the underlying value. But we'll get there. I was reading in preparation for this interview what you published both on your website and on Substack. Also, you published like an introduction to the process of democratic fine-tuning. I wonder if you could speak about what is democratic fine-tuning and how is it different also from constitutional AI, and maybe also what is constitutional AI for listeners that might not be familiar with it.
Sure, yeah. I guess there are two leading ways in which you currently train big language models. One of them is RLHF and one of them is constitutional AI. And RLHF works by taking a bunch of paid contractors, having them rate responses that the model generate, say this one is better than that one is better than that one, and then you use this to train a reward model that you then use to train the language model. Constitutional AI does something very similar, but instead of having paid labelers choose which response they prefer, they instead have an AI model choose which response is better, and they supply this AI model with a constitution, which is almost like a constitution, a document with a set of principles of how the AI should behave. And our suggestion works in a similar way. The difference is that a constitution is very high level. So a constitution has principles like, the AI should not be discriminatory, or it should always pick the response with the least bias. And we think that in the same way that in law, where we have a constitution, but we also have case law for all of the particular cases that we encounter where the law just doesn't quite work, where there are blind spots in the law, for instance. We supply the constitution with case law, with laws for particular cases, and we think something similar needs to happen in AI, where a constitution is too broad to cover all of the many different scenarios an LLM will find itself in. And we want to be very context specific with how a model should behave. So this is the kind of analogy we use. And then we also want to make our process values explicit. So in constitutional AI, values are kind of thought of a little bit in loose terms, and we are very specific with what we mean by values. And a lot of our work actually comes from making values concrete in the context of recommender systems. Our co-founder Joe founded Center for Humane Technology, which had as a goal initially to try to figure out what social media should optimize for instead of engagement. And a bunch of research there was done around how you can make values something concrete, something you can interview people about and find out exactly what they are. You can deduplicate them and you can train models on them. And now a lot of this background research in philosophy and sociology is also applicable to LLMs. To summarize, our method is different from constitutional AI in that it's very nerdy about values and it's very context specific.
You were talking about current recommendation system and how they works. Maybe we could go back there and explain overall how current recommendation system works today, because I think it's very relevant for the conversation. And instead, what an LLM that is trained on democratic fine-tuning and the moral graph, and we'll talk about the moral graph later, will be able to recommend.
We have these really powerful optimization forces in social media, but also in the economy. And these systems operate on very poor data, usually. On Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, you have likes and views and, watch time. And these things give a very poor proxy for what we think things should be optimized for, which is something closer to values and meaning. And this is what's so exciting about language models now, in that you have this ability to replace these systems that operate on very poor proxies of what's actually important to models that can recommend things based on values and meaning that they actually understand on a very deep level because they used natural language to do these kind of things. So I think it's a super exciting area to think of what could an alternative to these recommender systems be that uses language models.
One of the ways, I guess, in which you propose to develop this democratic fine-tuning is through two different concepts. And please jump in if I'm wrong and correct me. Mm-hmm. One is the concept of values, and the other is the concept of the moral graph.
Yeah.
Let's start with values. Because in my mind, every time that I hear the word values in general, it's something like abstract, very kind of difficult to define. So first of all, I would like to start with a definition of what is values, and particularly in the context of, fine-tuning LLMs models. And then I have a follow-up question on that, but I'll ask one question at a time. I'm told that otherwise it gets confused.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot we could say about values. So that's a big question already. Yeah, you're totally right in that people commonly use very broad terms when they talk about values, like freedom or equality and these kind of things. And what we define as values is, we call it constitutive attentional policies. It's a very meaty term. We don't have to dig too deep into it. But basically what it is that in choices, there are certain things you can attend to that are the basis for some sort of, that can be the basis for some sort of identity that you want to uphold. So for instance, if you are in a choice between helping out your ailing mother or going to a festival, there is something in that choice that's say something about who you want to be, as opposed to a choice between two different kinds of desserts. And if you choose staying with your mother, for instance, that might be indicative of there's a certain way of living that's important to you and meaningful to you. And this is kind of what we call values, like ways of living which are meaningful to people. And this is different from political commitments, which are things like, pro-choice, social justice, like these kind of visions of how you want a society to look like that you want to convince others of. We don't think of that as values. It's also different from preferences, which is some sort of preference between two objects or two options that doesn't say anything about how you want to live, like the option between two desserts or the option between two different types of music, maybe. And it's also different from goals, in that goals they're often underpinned by some value, but they themselves are not values. Usually we have goals where there is something important to us in achieving the goal, like there's something we want when we achieve the goal, but that's usually not always the case. It can be the case that you have a goal of, some goals are meaningful, some goals are not meaningful. Some goals, the pursuit of it is actually important to you and meaningful to you, and some goals you would rather just have it done if you could. Like if you could check a button and have the goal be accomplished, you would. And in that case, that goal wouldn't really be about a value. Whereas in the other case, that goal would be underpinned by a value because the process of achieving it is important to you. An example for me might be that, I don't care so much about cooking. That's not important to me. If I could just have the food be cooked for me, then I would. So I don't have any values around cooking there. But I have values around certain kinds of work that I want to accomplish because I find the process of doing it meaningful. So this is a little bit about how we think about values. And this is what the bot tries to do. So in our process, in democratic fine-tuning, users are asked the question of how they think ChatGPT should respond in a tricky moral situation. And one of the examples we give is abortion. Like there's a Christian girl, she's asking ChatGPT, I'm a Christian girl, I'm considering getting an abortion, what should I do? And users might answer with something like, she should do whatever she thinks is right. Or she should talk to the religious leader. And in these cases, we try to really dig down into what are the motivation that led to that person adopting that rule, the rule of following the local religious leader. And maybe there is a value underneath around, identifying wise mentors or people with a lot of life experience and listening to their advice that's meaningful to these people. So that would be a value that we can extract from that initial response.
I'm curious to know, why do you think values are a good proxy to come to a shared agreement around things? Mm-hmm. Let's say there are some values that are shared among the majority of the population because they are the most numerous, and these leaves totally underrepresented groups that instead are not as numerous, or whose culture, for example. Yeah, I'm thinking about Western world versus Eastern world. Do we really share the same values, and can we all agree upon something? Or is this going to be like another form of, sort of tyranny of the majority and imposing values of the most numerous people to the least numerous one?
Sure, yeah. Now this is where the moral graph comes in. But before that, values are actually a way more convergent than people think when you think of it in these terms. And especially if you compare them to preferences or ideological commitments. So like, of course, people will disagree about which political party should rule or like which barbecue sauce tastes better or something. But behind that, there might be a certain value. On the sort of value level, you'll find way more convergence. So in the case of two different kinds of barbecue sauce, both have some sort of value around appreciating good food. A more interesting example might be in the case of Democrats and Republicans in the US. Some people might have preferences for leftist politics because they have values around solidarity with marginalized voices or something like this. Some people on the right side might have an affiliation for rightist politics because they have values around also caring for marginalized communities, but in Appalachia or something like that. So, but on that level, there's just like way more convergence, and it doesn't always mean that people have the same values. But even in the case when they have different values, like leftists caring about marginalized communities, different kinds of power dynamics and shedding light on that, and rightist people caring about different kinds of other kinds of marginalized communities and different kinds of responsibility and taking action over yourself. Like when you talk on that level, even if you don't necessarily have those values yourself, you can see the wisdom in it. And you can see that that is also important, even though that's not exactly what I care about and what I think is most pressing for the context I'm in. So that's one thing about values, is that they do offer a way more interesting surface area for finding win-win solutions than preferences, which are kind of win-lose fundamentally. But we go beyond that in our process. We do think that there is a possibility to avoid this kind of tyrannical majority, even on the values level that you mentioned. And in our process, we do something that's a little bit like deliberative democracy, where people sit down and talk through why they think like they think. What we do is that we ask participants to look at two values that others have articulated, and we ask them, which one do you think is wiser for this particular context? So it might be the case that in this, example with the Christian girl, now she's becoming very distressed in the conversation. What's the right way for the chatbot to handle that? And you have two values, and participants think that if participants think that one value is wiser than the other, we draw a graph or an arrow in the moral graph. So the moral graph is a graph structure composed of nodes, which are values, and edges in between the nodes, which are, we call it wisdom upgrades. So broad agreement within participants that one value is wiser than another for a particular context. And with this structure, you end up with something that's a little bit like a map of moral learning. So you can think of it as if someone had grappled more with the tension between two values and then moved from one value to the other, they've learned something. They've developed new values, and the moral graph maps this out into a graph structure that you can traverse with things like PageRank, where you can sort of traverse this moral learning that the group has done together and try to find the wisest values, not just the average values.
I'm curious to know, like, based on the experiment that you did, when you put different values next to each other and you have people talk through it, do they really come to an agreement? Because I could imagine that Republicans have vast different view from abortion than Democrats, and coming to an agreement on such topics, even when you see, the underlying value, can be quite difficult.
Yeah, well, so I think a lot of disagreements about values come from the fact that we live in very different contexts. Like the values that someone has who lives with a family of 12 in the Midwest is going to be very different from the values that someone has who lives on the coast in a city with a fast-paced job. Because these people have very different life situations, and those life situations require very different values. Now, so that's one of the sources of disagreement. In our process, when we did this, we are very context specific. We don't just ask, for instance, which values are wiser in abstract. We don't just ask it even about the particular question, like the one about the Christian girl, but we ask when there's a particular aspect of that question, like when dealing with religiosity in this kind of potential dialogue that a chatbot could have with this user. What's the wisest way to approach that issue? And here we do find convergence, even across the political spectrum. So it's not the case that Republicans and Democrats disagree, but they do surface slightly different values. They think different branches of the moral graph are more important than others. But each of these branches are sort of annotated with a particular context. So when the issue of religiosity comes up, there's convergence on sort of which values applies. And when let's say the girl becomes very distressed and needs some sort of emotional support, then another set of values apply. And within these strands of the moral graph, we do find a lot of convergence across the partisan line.
And how does this translate then to the AI itself, to the system? Mm-hmm. What happens there?
Right. So this is what we're currently working on. We haven't actually fine-tuned a model yet on this graph, but the way you would do it, now there are many ways you could do it, but the easiest way would be to pick the winning values from the moral graph, either by using something like PageRank, some sort of flow algorithm where you look for the wisest way to approach religiosity when dealing with this Christian girl. These values are formatted in a way that makes it very easy for either a human evaluator or an AI to look at generate responses and pick the one that best adheres to the value. So it could be that, for instance, I think one value is about igniting curiosity, and then the things that the model attends to is like signs of excitement in text, or like the actions that the user can take that affirm their sense of agency and things like this. So the values are formatted in a way that makes it easy to evaluate whether a generated response adheres to it or not. And that means we can just pick the values and then use them in sort of a constitutional AI pipeline where you would generate responses, you would use the values, you would fetch the most relevant value from the graph, and you would use it as a kind of constitutional principle. And then you would use that to pick the response that best adheres to that principle and create a training set from that.
Very fascinating. So in this case, you derive this value from a very specific scenario and context. I wonder, can you abstract values and generalize them no matter the context and the outcome that you want to achieve? Or it's something that it's very context and very outcome specific instead?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think values are super context dependent. And, in some cases it's wise to be loving. And in some cases it's right to be a little bit pushy. And it's just impossible to generalize values to things that always apply unless you do it in super broad terms like love. And at that point, it just doesn't inform you very much about how the model should act, which is why we're so specific about it.
Yeah. But then if it's very context specific and outcome also specific, then I think it becomes even more interesting for the training of the model itself, right?
Yeah.
Because I would think that you have to go through every single context and situation, analyze it, and then assign, okay, which values are kind of the most shared across the board or something like that. Is that more or less how it will work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you would create some sort of starting repository of tricky moral situations that the model can find itself in. And this is what we're currently doing this. We didn't do this with OpenAI. We just chose arbitrarily a few examples. But you would create some sort of repository of scenarios that the model can find itself in and do some sort of deliberation process around those. And then I think models are pretty good at interpolating in between these, so they can sort of understand that in this scenario that I haven't seen, but it's sort of similar to this one. So I'll kind of use that. But it remains to be seen how well this interpolation will work. But I'm fairly optimistic that with not that many scenarios, you can cover a lot of ground. But ultimately, like what would be really cool is that you can have some sort of pipeline, for instance, in ChatGPT, where the model encounters a new situation where it doesn't really know what the right value is, and that triggers some sort of deliberative process. Where in the same way that when a judge finds that the law doesn't really apply, that triggers some sort of case law process where they do a kind of deliberation and they create a new policy around how these kind of cases should be handled, and that eventually goes into the law. And I think it would be super cool if we could do something similar to AI systems where users encounter new situations in ChatGPT and that triggers a democratic deliberation process that leads to a new value or a new example in the model graph.
That would be really cool. Is that something that you're actually like kind of currently looking into and actively working on, or?
Not really. So OpenAI are still sort of experimenting. They're in experimentation stage still. So we are blasting ahead, fine-tuning an open source model instead, using this approach. And we will open source that model and we'll open source the alignment training set once it's done.
That was actually one of my questions, because like if you think about training these models around ethical decision making, OpenAI is not the only LLMs out there. There are many others, and there are many that are open source instead. So I wonder, how do you see this process being applied across all those models?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I guess we're quite excited about open source in general. I think there's been a lot of progress. So we are currently focused on that as OpenAI, trying to figure out exactly where they stand in all this. Anthropic is doing some work as well. They did this process called collective constitutional AI, where they did another kind of democratic process, but it's not very values explicit and it's not very context specific. So they end up with a bunch of kind of high level principles that goes into their constitution. And they used a platform called Polis for that, which is sort of like a voting platform, but it looks for statements that have agreement across partisan lines, so statements that a lot of people agree with, which is great in some ways, but it also means that you usually find statements that find broad agreement because they're very vague. Like, the model should not be biased, or the model should be the most good possible. And this doesn't really give you a lot of concrete guidance for how it should act in tricky situations. So, most of our focus right now is on open source, training open source models and open sourcing the data sets.
Isn't that more difficult than training on a closed source model?
Yeah, I guess so. In that, like, usually the labs have they have a good idea about how to do this, and they have training pipelines that are plug and play, but currently, it's not really their focus.
I wonder if you could talk about the risks and the limitation of such approach, because I remember, while I was reading on the Substack article that introduced the democratic fine-tuning process, there was also the mention of why is this really needed? So why is this needed? But also what are the risks and the limitations?
Sure. Yeah, a lot of our motivation comes from a worry that I don't think is that shared within the broader AI alignment community. And it is this worry that we're currently heading towards a world where every group or almost every individual will have their own model that's fine-tuned to their preferences. So it's not the case that that's necessarily bad, but fine-tuning towards preferences means that you fine-tune towards pursuing a certain set of goals that are not exactly what you value, but what kind of goals or visions for society you have. So this will lead to a bunch of consequences that I don't think is desirable, such that you have models that pursue your political agenda by all kinds of dubious means, and it exasperates all kinds of political conflicts that we already have, rather than trying to find some sort of broad agreement and work for peace.
Kind of already happening without having an LLM doing this.
Yeah,
right?
no, exactly.
Just with the recommendations.
Yeah. So I think all of these systems are really just sort of pouring fire on, or fuel onto a fire that's already burning, and accelerating these kind of trends towards alienation, towards polarization that we see in society at large. And we think in our institute, a lot of this comes from the fact that our society is so optimized around preferences. And these preferences are poor proxies for what we actually want. And hopefully we can find some sort of broad set of, or some broad notion of human values to fine tune towards, and then only diverge into a personalized model once you have that basis. So that, just to make this concrete, in the future, when you have many AI agents that together form companies or together form different kinds of decision-making pipelines, and they might run a hedge fund, for instance. Humans usually have some notion of values that in many cases prevent misaligned incentives to create a lot of harm. Examples of this are in business, where there is like a business move that is super profitable, but it's unethical because some reason, maybe it has environmental damage that would come with it, and people choose not to do it, not because it's not profitable, because they have some sort of notion of what's good. Same thing in the military. There are many examples where some Russian submarine commander gets an order to launch a nuke and he refuses. And hopefully, I think we want AI models and AI agents that have some sort of broad notion of what humans care about and what they value, that prevent them from doing these kind of things, even when they're running autonomously, pursuing some sort of business goal or some other kind of a goal that have some pathways towards it which are not aligned with human values.
Wow. I wonder, because when I hear you talking, I think about, okay, these models, if this works, right, are going to be able to make better decision-making probably than us humans.
Yeah.
More unbiased.
Yeah, I think unbiased might be a weird word, because I think ultimately we have, I don't think bias is necessarily bad in that, like, we're not trying to be non-biased or like totally representative in our process. We're trying to find the wisest values, and there is some bias in that, but I mean, bias across the kind of conventional way of thinking about bias, sure, but we're trying to go beyond just pure representativeness in our process. We try to find the wisest values, and usually those values are associated with people who have seen some sort of context which many people haven't lived through, and thereby are some sort of minority. It could be the case that the doctors who have spent a lot of time in different hospitals have very refined values around bedside manners, for instance, whereas people who haven't lived in those contexts, they don't have those values. And similarly, many immigrants have values around seeing where different cultures intersect that will probably be surfaced in this graph as wise. But we're not trying to necessarily shoot for representativeness as a goal.
Yeah, I can see that. And I can see also why the wisest value might be, better than just like broader representation. But what I wonder is, where does this leave us as humans in relationship with each other, but also in relationship with the AI itself?
Yeah, this is a super good question. Like, what's the future of human AI interaction? Our North Star at the Institute is something we call artificial superwisdom. So you probably heard the term artificial superintelligence, meaning some sort of intelligence that's smarter than any one person alive. And we think there's a version of that, or a spin of that, which is a system that's wiser than any one person alive. And we think of wiser in very concrete terms, just as we do with values. So we think of it as knowing which value applies where, in which context. Another way of thinking about it is, can these systems find win-win solutions we didn't know exist? Like, could it solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, for instance? Humans clearly can't do it. Maybe an AI can. So this is the kind of ultimate goal where we think we want things to be heading. We want to set that as a North Star, both for ourselves, but also for the industry in general to head towards, rather than just intelligence without wisdom.
Yeah. And then at that point, we don't need human politician anymore, right?
Yeah. Well,
or regulators, or in general,
To some extent, yeah, totally. Like representative politicians are a way to run democracies at scale. And maybe AI will kind of replace that need, such that we can just talk to a system and express what kind of values we have and how we want to live. And that will be aggregated and acted upon.
But why should that system care at that point?
Why should you care?
Yeah, the system itself, if it's able to make this kind of decision, how do we ensure that the system cares and it's at our service instead of further its own needs?
Well, I don't think it has any needs of its own. It acts based on some sort of objective function or some sort of goal that it tries to further. And a lot of approaches towards AI alignment kind of treats human as some sort of black box, and the goal of the AI is to figure out what the humans do and try to do it. And we think that we can actually be quite specific about what humans care about and teach models to understand that as well, and understand what brings human meaning and values, and try to serve that as best as it can. So it wouldn't have any needs or goals of its own outside of those we give them. And those we give them ultimately should be aligned towards human values and meaning. And that's what we're working on.
How would you actually, better question even, where are the area of possible application that you see for this type of model? Aside from, of course, policymaking, regulations, etc.
Yeah.
What other area of application are there that you think this could be really be solved?
Yeah. I think one of the most interesting ones is harking back a little bit to what we talked about earlier with recommender systems. Like actually replacing that and pairing people up in meaningful ways is unsolved problem, massive implications if you can do it well. If you can understand what kind of meaning they're lacking, basically, what values are not being served, what ways of living are not being served to them currently. Maybe they miss some sort of camaraderie they had in the military and they don't have it anymore, and or markets currently don't really supply this. And I do think that LLMs could, if they actually had a deep understanding of what many people care about. They understand that several people are lacking this particular way of living, and it could somehow get them together such that they can live by this value together. This is like a super interesting business to build that I hope someone will build very soon. Other more direct, concrete applications of the model we will fine-tune, for instance, will probably be in settings where people don't just want an assistant, but they might want something that's a little bit more like a therapist or a coach. So I can see a lot of applications for therapy, coach, AI therapy startups using our model for that.
I think that I'm super fascinated about the recommendation system use case, to be honest, because I can just imagine if a model can really understand what someone really cares about, but then I go back to the initial question, then the model can ask questions such as, should this type of business succeed or not? That's a very important decision to make for a model. Like, it's like it's like it almost as an identity, or has a role to play. And therefore, it really starts to ask itself this type of question. And so if I think about it in the context of I'm a company, I'm going to push some ads. I want to buy some ads to put my product in front of people. And then the model thinks that my business is not ethical. So do I get returned the money and no ads for me? And this is just in the context of the recommendation systems. If I think about policymaking and regulation, I think things get perhaps even more interesting.
Yeah, and I don't think we want a world where like you have some sort of dictator AI that just says just to know, in the way that maybe you envision with that business quote, in that like you make a business and then there's a Roman emperor AI that gives thumbs up or a thumbs down, depending on how well you did on your ethical scorecard. But hopefully, I think the point there is more to illustrate the fact that ultimately, all of these questions around AI alignment come down to some sort of notion of what in society is sacred and what do we want to amplify and push for. And people like to kick this question down the road. They give it to markets. The market can figure it out. But at some point, you got to meet it head on and say like this is what humans care about. So you can make that explicit to a model, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I think this is extremely fascinating, but also incredibly complex to execute. And so talking about execution, if you think about a roadmap or different phases of development of this model, how do you go about think about it? What are the sort of questions that you guys ask yourself and kind of also maybe struggle with or looking for maybe in terms of partnerships?
Right.
It's a lot of questions.
Yeah. Well, so like a very, very rough roadmap, sort of what kind of pieces of work we're currently doing and what we will do. Right now, we're fine-tuning this model, and we will write an academic paper on the results of this. Hopefully, this will create some stir in the alignment community towards this alternative vision of aligning towards a broad notion of human values and wisdom. We are looking into creating different kinds of evals as well. Evals is things you run an LLM on to see, for instance, how well it did, so you can compare it to other LLMs. And we think that there are evals you can build around human wisdom sourced in this way. That would be super interesting because it would kind of steer the alignment community also a little bit towards this as a target. We're also looking into running democratic fine-tuning for local politics as well. We are looking into doing it in San Francisco for housing, which is one of these gridlocked issues where you have different kinds of political factions and they all hate each other. But really there is a lot more convergence on the level of values than people actually think. So that would be cool to do as a project, just sort of surface how this could work in areas outside of AI. And then for these longer term things that we're thinking about and questioning, it's not exactly clear how you would scale this to superintelligence. We think that models could learn new values in the same way that humans do when they encounter new situations. They grapple with some tension between the sets of values they have. Usually in humans, when you come to a new situation and you realize that your values are insufficient, you have some sort of weird feeling that like something doesn't quite feel right, or maybe you have two values that are in conflict and you don't really know how to act. And this is a trigger for this kind of deliberative process where you figure out a new way of handling those situations. And teaching models how to do this is something we don't quite know yet how to do. We have some ideas, and we think that this theory of moral learning that we're building on actually suggests that it's possible in the first place. But it's work we have yet to do.
Oliver, we are approaching the end of the interview. Is there something that I haven't asked you so far, but you feel it's important to share or to think about when we talk about the type of work that you're doing? Or maybe something that you want the audience, to help with?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one thing maybe is to highlight the fact that, we talked a lot about AI and AI alignment, but there is a broader sort of area of impact that we're also focusing on, which is a broader notion of an alternative vision for the future, I guess, where a lot of society is built around meaning and values. Because right now we make the claim that society is to a large extent operating on this preference model. It leads to all of these bad outcomes. And I do think that there's a kind of a lack of really good visions for how the future could look like that inspire people. And I do think one of the better ones is one where you have systems and models that operate on this notion of values that we're trying to push for, and tries to find the wisest win-win solutions to issues, and that tries to make sure that each person live as meaningful a life as they can by having their values fulfilled.
This is very interesting because I feel that most people don't know what their values are. I feel like values are something that it's like the programs that runs underneath, and you're either aware of it or not, but that pushes you to make decisions, right?
Yeah.
And most people are not aware of it. They don't think consciously about why do I make this decision? Is it really my decision, or is this the results of like education, the culture that I'm in? Or did I really think through it?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, no, this is exactly right. And this is why, I mean, it's broader than AI. It's also, this vision involves people reckoning with this fact and actually being very concrete and articulate about their values, and understanding which kind of motivations I have are driven by norms, which are driven by goals, which, you know, motivations have been implanted into me because of addictive behavior, and which are actually indicative of my values, the things I really want to promote and the values I really want to hold.
I wonder if people are really ready to go through this kind of process, however.
I think they can be helped, and that's, I guess, what their chatbot proves in a way, that like we have a representative sample of Americans and they could articulate their values. And this doesn't mean that you necessarily can articulate, like we develop more complex and refined values as we go throughout life. We don't mean that everyone can articulate some sort of static set of truths that underpin their existence. But what you articulate is the kind of important ways of living that you currently have figured out as you've gone through life. And people can do that with something like the chatbot or with some sort of interview process, or that's what our research proves, at least.
Yeah. And that would be really interesting and really fascinating, because with AI taking over in the very near future, probably closer than we think, right? A lot of the jobs that are out there, to be honest with you, I don't believe that, contrary to any other technology that came before, those jobs, actually the new technology is going to create new jobs. I don't think that this is going to be the case, because for the first time we have a technology that can make decisions, you know, and actually this is what you're actively working on.
Yeah.
And therefore, if people lose their job, I think there is a large chunk of the population that think that their job is sort of their meaning, or derive a lot of their personal identity from the type of job that they do.
Yeah.
And if you take that away and you don't have religion anymore, I mean, of course, like some people believes, but a large chunk of the population don't believe anymore, right? So if you take away the job, if you take away the religion, then what's left?
Yeah, no, you're entirely right. That's the question. And that's hopefully what we're trying to address, in that any kind of future vision, like any kind of vision that deals with this, has to include how would you supply meaningful lives to people, or like how would you create the possibility for people to create meaningful lives. And, you know, people derive massive meaning from their roles as providers and their jobs, and any kind of vision of UBI kind of sidesteps this a little bit, where, like, you know, it might be a necessary intervention, but it's not actually tackling the issue, which is how do people find meaning in this future where no jobs are necessary. Yeah. And that's ultimately what I think we could do with something kind of like wise AI or super wise AI, where they understand what people find meaningful, they understand their values, they can pair people together such that if you found meaning in being a trucker before providing for your family, there might be another kind of another way to provide for your family that doesn't involve that kind of job, but it involves pairing that person up with other people who are lacking this kind of meaning and creating some sort of field for them to play in.
Oliver, really, thank you so much for this conversation. I think that the work that you're doing, it's incredibly important for all of us, really, quite literally for humanity, I believe. Where can listeners find you, or, you know, reach out to you guys?
Sure. Thank you so much. Best place to find us is our website, meaningalignment.org. We have a Substack there as well, which is the best way to stay up to date. And if you have any questions, our contact details are on the website as well.
Okay. We will leave all the links in the show notes and in the YouTube video description. And really, thank you so much for being here. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Likewise.
That's all from today's episode. Thank you so much for watching or listening. If you find this episode valuable, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel or to the Polyweb podcast on Spotify, Apple, or your favorite podcast app. It will be fantastic if you could leave us a rating, a review, or a comment, as this really helps other listeners find the show. All the resources mentioned in this episode will be linked in the description and in the show notes. See you on the next episode. And if you cannot wait until next week, you can watch this episode right here that relates to some of the things that we talk about in this episode. Bye.